My name is Jim Frieda, and I'm very, very pleased to be here for the 2025 Applied Active Inference Symposium. I want to thank the organizers and for being so open in their acceptance policy and letting someone like me present. I am a deep tissue structural body worker, a manual therapist, an embodiment teacher, and a somatic historian and social theorist. My interest is not in computational neuroscience, mathematics, computer science, and physics, but I have a deep interest in a model of life, and especially in the perceptual mechanics of a model of life from a somatic perspective. My interest in active inference derives from my focus on what is called the deep core myofascial synergy, which is the anatomy, the synergistic and very new anatomy of our axial line, our postural core. Sherrington describes this system as proprioception or self-awareness. And when I came across Sherrington's a marvelous text, The Integrative Action of the Nervous System, and his neural architecture of the animal as a whole, it really blew me away. It really changed everything about how I was working with people, working with myself, and understanding my own self-image and the world. When I came across Carl Friston's updated version of the model, I was really blown away, very excited, and I just love the work that the active inference community is doing. I do not have computational, neuroscientific, computer scientific kinds of critiques and suggestions to offer, but my field is anatomy. And from the perspective of anatomy, and especially the self-organizing, self-aware, self-balancing, self-organizing, and self-directed generative anatomy of the human body, I do have a lot to say. This is a new kind of anatomy. For the purposes of today's talk, I'm calling it cybernetic anatomy in the cybernetic tradition, or we can call it synergistic myofascial anatomy. And this is really the key to understanding the motoric element of the deep field in the model, the motoric element of the physical homeostatic function of active inference itself. We're going to talk about a few major points here. I'm going to go over, in addition to some guided body meditations that I hope that you will find novel and enlightening, we're going to spend some time reviewing Sherrington's original model, the neural architecture of the animal as a whole. I have a big section on that. There's an awful lot of text. I'm going to summarize it, but I put all the text there so that you can go back and do your research, because a lot of the belief updating that we're going to be doing in this talk today involves the major contours, the global outline of the superordinate model, which is 3 receptor fields: exteroception, interoception, and proprioception. Now, the core node, proprioception, I argue, has been under-theorized, and proprioception is the least well understood of the 3 different perceptual systems. The model, we understand, contains 2 blankets, but I want to give the inner blanket, the outer surface of the inner self, in the nucleus, what would be the, very importantly, mechanotransductive nuclear membrane, the lamina membrane of the outer surface of the inner component of the cell, as an intuitive example of a model, of the model, that is, by analogy, we can also find in ourselves, in our body. This motoric element has been under-theorized, and it's actually missing from the model. Proprioception lacks a motoric element. The deep field lacks motoric anatomy. What we're going to find is exteroceptive bias. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the blanket politics in the model, that if these two perceptual fields have agency and have identity, which it's clear that they do, and theoretically which they must, then we can talk about their relationship in terms of blanket politics. And I'm going to call forth both Carl Friston's disconnection hypothesis and Gregory Bateson's double bind as a way to discuss that. I'd like to invite you into a guided meditation on the grip, on how to get a grip on the reach. The reach, the arm, the forelimb of any animal is something that we study to understand its unique adaptive potential in its environment. The human upper extremity, the human forelimb, the arm, and the hand, of course, are very, very special and allow us a tremendous amount of control and sensitivity within our environment. And this has been studied hundreds and thousands of times by motor control theorists and neurologists and biomechanists. And it's something that we should really be very familiar with. Out here in the hand is the exteroceptive grip. What I want us to focus on today is the proprioceptive prior, which is located in the armpit. Now, that armpit is formed by a single large bone called a scapula. Now, this scapula, you'll notice, is shaped exactly like a grip, and your hand fits around it perfectly. And indeed, there are 5 intrinsic muscles arrayed over this that literally grab onto it, above and below, with their tendinous insertions wrapping around the shoulder joint, forming the rotator cuff. And this is the system that anchors the arm to the body, but also that manages that originary kind of joint, the shoulder joint, that manages it and maintains centration and balance and stability in that very insecure joint. So we're going to reach out with our hand. And if there's someone there, grasp their hand gently. If there isn't someone there, if you have a cell phone or a coffee cup, grasp that and feel how your little finger is like a hook that secures that object in your hand, how the thumb coming over the top is a kind of a clamp, and how you get a grip in the exteroceptive system, reaching out into the world. But even though this is the applied active inference conference, I'm going to suggest that we come back, not reach outward, but reach inward into the armpit, not the shoulder. Now, this is, again, an exteroceptive knuckle, a superficial structure, and a rather insignificant, motorically speaking and perceptually speaking, structure that is not well innervated. We're going to come into this very sensitive armpit. The armpit is a product of the scapula's attachment on the back of the ribs. And those proprioceptive movements, postural movements, are long, slow, continuous, and mild. They really are the expression of active inference in the mortal substrate. So we have this grip in the hand with a parallel or a mirror synergy, an inverse homology in the scapula in the armpit. And see if you can feel that. And just as an exercise, let's organize our arm with our shoulder. Let's use the neck and the shoulder to lift the arm, which is very common and results in all kinds of pathologies like impingement syndrome and frozen shoulder. Instead, let's come down deep within the armpit and bring that elbow in contact with the ribs and come up into the concavity, the sensitive pit of the gradient of the armpit. And feel a hand literally imagine that as you have a hand out in the world, you have a hand reaching inward in the body, a literal hand grasping that scapula. Now, that hand, that sense of a grip, wraps around the bony scapula with its fingertips, the tendinous fingertips of those muscles, wrapping around the shoulder joint like fingertips around a doorknob, forming the rotator cuff, and giving that insecure glenohumeral joint the stability and centration that it needs for this amazing range of motion that we have. That comes from deep within the proprioceptive prior of the armpit, of the concavity. And indeed, the body has a system of major concavities on the axial line, all with this kind of a function. And those 5 intrinsic muscles really create a synergy, a mirror synergy, an inverse homology that the brain finds very easy to work with. Now, the last thing that I want to say is to come out of that meditation and to look here at this theory. These are some recent, very interesting motor control studies of the reach and the grasp. And you'll see here outlined in green, I've highlighted a graphic from each study. Now, this is universal. Every single motor control study originates in the shoulder, the knuckle of the shoulder on the one hand, and on the other hand in the grip, and attempts to calculate proprioception from this very false structure. Instead, if we reach deeper within and understand the motoric anatomy of the proprioceptive, of the deep field of proprioception, I wonder how that would change our studies and our research, our thinking about proprioceptive priors. We're going to take a few minutes here to do a deep dive, and I have a number of slides coming up with a lot of content. We're going to do a deep dive into the model, and we're going to go back to the origin, the 1906 origin, Charles Sherrington's neural architecture of the animal as a whole. And it's Charles Sherrington. Charles Sherrington was a great scholar, a tremendous scientist, and a man of letters. And when he named something, he really thought about it, and his names have weight. And we've gone and really renamed or reinterpreted, redefined the neural architecture of the animal as a whole without considering the original model itself. So we're going to spend some time going into that. Exteroception, interoception, and proprioception were all words that Sherrington created with a great deal of intentionality and rationale. Now, it's a perceptual model, but it's a spatial model, which is great for somatic thinkers like myself, because kinesthesia, the muscle sense, somatics, is a spatial form of awareness, where we're not looking to ask why or how, but we're asking where. Where do we go in our experience with our perceptual faculties in order to encounter those affordances in the environment and within ourselves that possess the information theoretic content that we need? This is the nature of living systems and working with complex self-organizing and self-aware living systems. Now, the model has 2 great separate fields. There's an outside and an inside. The debate really is, what's the inside? And what modern scholarship has done is taken interoception, exteroception, interoception, and made the very simplistic and naive assumption that, well, that's the outside and the inside. Intero must mean inside. And this isn't really true. Sherrington referred to the deep field repeatedly, and proprioception is the deep field or the core in the model. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read this third paragraph. Multicellular animals, regarded broadly throughout a vast range of animal forms, are cellular masses which present to the environment a surface sheet of cells, and underneath that surface sheet a bulk made up of cells more or less screened from the environment by the surface sheet overlying them. Many of the agencies by which the environment acts on the organism do not penetrate to the mass of cells forming the organism's deeper part. The various stimuli expend themselves as stimuli at the surface sheet and do not penetrate into the depth of the organism. So Sherrington is really trying to talk about a part of the body that is insulated most fully from the outside world, the deep field, the core, proprioception. And he identified that as a mechanical system, a muscular system, the postural system, compressions and strains produced by muscles. Not only that, but this inner receptor field, perceptual system, is not other-aware. It is most self-aware. Let's take a look at Sherrington's arguments around interoception and the surface field. Again, the surface field is broadly subdivisable. Its subdivisions are two. So the external field is cutaneous, but the inner surface then would be alimentary. Anything that passes through the boundary sheet of an organism has to be processed, for example, by the cytoplasm in the cell, by the alimentary canal, by the viscera, by the gut, what Sherrington called the kitchen. This is not the deep field. This is still something that, although shielded from the outside, still is basically working with processing, sensing stimuli that come from the outside. Now, it's important to recognize, I think, and to take a moment with this bottom paragraph to just go ahead and look that exteroception is special and important in a way, in that, and these words I think are really, really nice, it's facing outward on the general environment, and it receives freely, and it receives and has received for countless ages the full stream, I love this language, the full stream of all the varied agencies, forever pouring on it freely from the outside world. So there's a bit of a basis with exteroceptive bias. In terms of the perceptual fields, exteroception has to always be operative from the moment of birth onward. And this is one good explanation for bias in the system. But the real bias that we're facing is an accentuation of interoception and a diminishment of proprioception. So let's look at Sherrington. The stimuli effective on the receptors of the deep field differ fundamentally from those on either subdivision of the surface field. They are adapted for excitation by changes going forward in the organism itself. Now, in interoception, in the gut, the excitations are coming from the red pepper and the garlic that you might have had with your spaghetti. But in the deep field, it really is the contractions and relaxations of muscles of the postural system hugging the core, hugging the spine itself, which are the basis, the priors, the postural basis for the rest of the actions of the body. Since in the deep field, the stimuli to the receptors are delivered by the organism itself, the deep receptors may be termed proprioceptors, meaning self-awareness, and the deep field a field of proprioception. Now, this is a postural and a tonic system, and we've discussed that, but it's tightly interwoven, not with interoception, but with exteroception, and maintains tonic reactions in the skeletal musculature. Sherrington describes these wonderfully steady, long, continued, untiring, and, for the most part, mild contractions. And this is known as their tone. Tone, Sherrington spends a long time talking about tone. The muscle sense was a major topic of 19th century explorations into perception, but also into the physics of life. And I love what Sherrington says, and he says that tone serves as an adjuvant to the muscle sense. Now, in the literature, since Sherrington, these terms have gotten twisted around quite a bit. And there's a real consensus in the literature. These are a number of quotes here from different serious studies and scholars making the point, for example, that proprioception predominates as the most misused term within the sensory-motor system. Jumping down, proprioception is one of the least understood senses, yet fundamental for control of movement. And foot to the bottom, some major textbooks claiming to cover neuroscience barely mention it or mention it only in passing. But the truth is that if you do a search online, you're not going to get the proprioception that Sherrington just described. You're going to get a definition of it as positional awareness, typically, say, in the elbow or in the extremities. That's a very different creature. Positional awareness is a very different creature than self-awareness. And then what of interoception? Now, interoception has been redefined as comprehensive of all inner sense, which then includes proprioception, or proprioception as positional awareness. And proprioceptors might be considered interoceptors, Tsakiri says in a major study. Interoception then refers to the perception of the physiological condition. Now, what's happened is a very simple reinterpretation, and none of these studies engage Sherrington more than for a few lines or a few paragraphs at the most. But interoception has simply been redefined to mean inner sensation. And we now understand from Sherrington that was not his intent. That does not make sense. The cytoplasm is not constitutive of the inner self of the cell. That would be the nucleus. So interoception is not a source of self-awareness. It's not realistic to expect from it a self-identity. Exteroception, however, is, of course. Our outer sense of identity is quite rich and complete. But that inner sense of identity that comes from the functional unity, the body-wide axial core, also functions at the level of a self-identity and has the neural mass to support that kind of a hypothesis in the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Now, I just want to take a moment here, and I'm sorry if that was rough, but I want to take a little bit of a moment, a few minutes of your time, to explore this in the body. And we're just going to look at those three fields, and let's start on the outside, just to rehearse the Markov blanket, the outer surface of the surface sheet, with the five senses, with the extremities, with the skin, with our distance receptors, and we can look around and we can hear the cars far off in the distance or children playing. We can touch the things in our environment and touch ourselves on the outside. We have so many ways of relating to the outer world that it can be overwhelming and all-consuming. The importance of going deep within is so important. So we're going to start that process at the inner surface of the outer boundary. Naturally, we're going to start that process. And we can start in the mouth and in the nose. Inhaling, imbibing, coming down the esophagus, feeling the blood, feeling the heart, feeling the lungs, and all of the awareness that exists in the gut. That's interoception. Now that doesn't go all the way to the core, but it does go all the way to the other end of our tubular vertebrate torso with its chordate body plan to the excretory system. What comes in and comes out is a matter of interoception, but is part of the surface field. Next, we're going to start again here in the tongue. And we're going to identify that muscular system of the tongue running back in the back of the throat, in the back of the chest, behind the heart, in the front of the spine, behind the lungs, then expanding suddenly here into the whole diaphragm and coming down through the gut, not in the viscera, behind the viscera, in the motoric core, the postural core, the psoas muscles, running down through the pelvic basin and the groin, through the medial thighs and the adductors, down the legs, around the medial ankle and the medial arch to the big toe, and the surface of the feet, a body-wide myofascial, motoric muscular continuity. This deep inner field, proprioception, the postural system, the deep core, doesn't contain these distance receptors. It doesn't have visual and verbal and auditory awareness. It has haptic and muscular awareness, which nevertheless is tremendously rich. And this is something that we're going to encounter all day, every day. It is a daily part of our life, but if you go into a yoga studio, then that's what you're going to experience, is that system as you move in those long, slow, continuous tonic movements. I have been arguing that the core node has been under-theorized in the model, and that the most important aspect of that core node is the motoric anatomy of the deep field in the body. The deep field is the postural system and is the source of physical homeostasis. And if we do not have a clear anatomical understanding of that system, then I think it's reasonable to say it's under-theorized. So it's only a recent discovery that the nucleus has a nucleoskeleton and the importance of the mechanotransductive elements in the nuclear envelope. Now, it's also a recent discovery of the discovery of the myofascial synergistic nature of the body is a recent discovery. And we can see in these other pictures here, the core, we can see this one circular, this cutaway diagram of the abdomen. Now we can see the outer blanket of the abdominal muscles of the core. The traditional core that we think of on the outside of the body is complemented by an inner core that surrounds and supports and protects and expresses its neural content, the spinal cord. This inner core system is the myofascial synergy that I've been describing. Now, so I want to talk about two blankets, a double blanket theory. I want to propose that there are two blankets in the model and that they have a relationship that is problematic. We can call it blanket politics. We can think about that problematic relationship between these two systems in the body in terms of, for instance, disconnection hypothesis. because poor integration between these two major perceptual systems is going to have effects in terms of neuromodulation and sensory integration. Now, I'm not going to discuss that, but I am going to suggest that Bateson's notion of a double bind is relevant here. Now, let's look at a double bind. A double bind is a situation in which there's a victim who is exposed to multiple contradictory injunctions within a kind of a power dynamic, a power differential where escape is barred. There's a dependency. Now, the result of that is silence and immobilization. And we can see that in the body. Now, I think it's going to take a lot of work to really flesh that out, so to speak. But the double bind, we can think of that as a relationship, say, within a family between a parent and a child. And let's say there's a problematic relationship. Now, the child is sick and has recovered, is getting better, and the parent visits in the hospital, and the child gets out of bed and wants to embrace their parent and share their happiness and their gratitude, but the parent backs away and signals, no, we're not going to hug, we don't touch. And the child is immediately despondent and perhaps a little bit ashamed. And then the parent, having given one contradictory signal, gives the next and chides the child, saying something like, what's wrong with you? It's perfectly natural to love your parent. It's perfectly natural to want to express your joy. Why are you ashamed of yourself? And so then it puts the child, this dependent being, who can't escape in a situation where they can't do and they can't not do. They can't speak, but they can't not speak. A double bind. And the result then would be immobilization and silence. And I think that's an interesting metaphor for this outer blanket, the exteroceptive system, with all of its power and its enveloping presence, and this more dependent inner, very sensitive perceptual system, which nevertheless has its own impulses and needs, and which can be at odds. They can be at odds with each other. And so a lack of integration, then we would call that the double bind. I'm not sure really how to work with that, but I find that to be productive in terms of my own, working out my own inner blanket politics, so to speak. The solution, what's the solution? Well, first, to identify that dynamic, to be able to step outside of it, at least conceptually, but also empowerment, to give that victim agency. And one of the problems about under-theorization of the core node is that we don't have that. We don't have that empowerment and agency at the level that we really need it for belief updating in the global model. Belief updating in the global model, then, just to be really simple about it, there's a lot of text here, but the global model is going to be the superordinate level of the model, which would be the model itself, as we've already discussed, and its three fields, rather than some subsystem within it. It's going to be the level of the individual organism, the person, the self, and their own different ways, their own three different fields within the individual organism, but also the world model that we're working with. And we certainly can, in terms of thinking about surprisal, we certainly, at the level of global phenomenon, in the Anthropocene and collapse and technological overshoot and political strife that we're experiencing, we certainly can identify a great deal of surprisal, which should be telling us to look at, to revisit the global model. And I think that this interpretation is a salient one and a relevant one. Now, a little bit more about exteroceptive bias. Exteroceptive bias is going to be an innate tendency within the system. There simply are more receptors. There simply is a lot more going on exteroceptively than in any other field, certainly in the proprioceptive field. And the animal, when it's born, immediately has to look into the world around it to find warmth, shelter, food, kin, and that need doesn't stop, that continues. So there is an exteroceptive bias that is an innate tendency within the system, although it is not meant to be overwhelming, not meant to be in an imbalance and repressive. Instead, and so what happens then is that a control bias emerges when the balancing proprioceptive priors are not present in the system. Then there's a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, a vicious cycle that occurs, a control bias, in which exacerbates that imbalance. Now, we can see that in right hemispheric dominance and hyperintellectualization of our culture, which is increasing exponentially with the exponential changes in technology and the built environment. Self-evidencing, then, is one way of looking at how the body calibrates. Precision tracking and self-evidencing. Now, self-evidencing, what is self-evidencing? I think that's a great question. From an exteroceptive perspective, self-evidencing is a little bit abstruse because exteroception is other evidencing. The five senses provide the basis, the evidence required by science and reason. This is conventional. There's really nothing wrong with it. But self-evidencing is a property of a self-aware, a self-directed system. And that would be the core. That would be proprioception. That would be the core node in the model. Self-evidencing then is a natural property of the functioning of the proprioceptive core in its relationship, the body's deeper inner hidden relationship with itself. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at that, but we're going to talk about precision tracking. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about fascia, and we're going to talk about precision tracking in the model. Now, the rediscovery of fascia is a big deal. I'm a body worker, so I work with fascia. That is a recent phenomenon, and I would argue one of the most important shifts in anatomical science since Vesalius in 1543, that the restoration of the connective tissue matrix to the image of the body is a powerful, powerful form of belief updating. Now, we had removed the fascia because it was in the way. We believed it was simply a kind of white wrapping tissue that needed to be discarded so that we could see what was underneath, the individual muscles with their tendinous connections to the bones. A bunch of mechanistic little parts was revealed through the process, not of peeling away a wrapping paper, but of cutting away powerful chunks of flesh, because the muscles, this image that the muscle is connected to the bone and the bone is connected to another bone and to other muscles, is artificial. The bones and muscles are invested within a connective tissue matrix that provides 30 to 70% of the force production of the system, and which is itself an inner skin, a layered, complex inner skin. It's an elastic source of force production that's very important, but it's also a layered inner skin so that the intramuscular septa in the system, the interstitial tissues, the interstitial space is very, very sensitive, we now know. So by restoring that more integrative and holistic self-image, anatomical image of the body, then that in itself is very empowering. It certainly is empowering for me as a therapist because I understand it, but also in terms of my movements, it gives me a lot of insight into the feel that I have for these deeper, more subtle movements that we say experience in the yoga studio or in meditation, in Tai Chi or rehabilitation, etc. Myofascial synergies then are, now this is the one that I've been talking about, are the basis for a kind of biomechanical belief updating in the model. And my work, at least, comes from this wonderful text by Tom Myers, and where he has posited 12 different longitudinal myofascial continuities. This is not the only example, it is the preeminent example, but there are others in history and others available today. And an interesting hypothesis, a paper was published in the International Journal of Molecular Science, arguing that the myofascial unit, not the individual muscle, is the physiological basic element for peripheral motor control, that the basic unit of motor control is a myofascial synergy. Now, again, some different pictures of the deep core. And then getting a little bit more deeply into my system, what I've tried to do is to unpack this axial skeleton in terms of that axial line. And what we see here are how that axial line is intersected at each major juncture. At the one end of the spine, where the head meets the neck, at the other end of the spine, where the legs meet, where the hips meet the spine, and in the feet, where the ground connects with, in the feet, where the body connects with the ground. And each one of those junctures is represented by a circle because those are highly sensitive arrays, concavities, gradients, if you will, pits in the body, full of sensitive organs and tissues, full of complex junctures that come together with, at the center, a prominent central bony servo mechanism. Now, I want to apply these ideas to movement, and we're going to talk about kinesiology. So, conventional kinesiology of the exteroceptive system is adequately represented by the very, very primordial, simple stick figure that we see on cave walls, and that with just a few simple lines can represent the expressions and the movements of the body on the outside, the extremities. But it's interesting to note that stick figure has nothing to say about what is obviously, what is clearly the most important part of the body, its most sensitive contents, the axial line, the core. Now, there isn't a stick. Even the transmission of a car has linkages and articulations. So, getting back to that stick figure in conventional kinesiology, the kinesiology, the movements are oppositional. Flexion coming together, extension coming apart, adduction bringing the limbs to the body, abduction taking the limbs away from the body. They're oppositional. And then internal rotation, external rotation, oppositional movements. Now on the other side of the fence, in proprioception, in the axial line, in the core, in the synergistic system, this kinesiology is not oppositional, it's complementary. It's interdependent. And the movements of the axial structure are also diverse and significant, but we can describe them as the grip. We talked a little bit about the grip that we can get in the armpit. The scapula doesn't just grab the arm, it reaches around the ribs in a grip-like structure and contributes to centration and pressurization in the torso. Centration coming together, pressurization, a little bit of expansion, work together to create balance and stability in the body. On a longitudinal level, we push down through the posterior line and experience lift coming up through the front. This is something that's experienced in yoga all the time. Gravity, in fact, translated through the tensegrity structure of the body, does not pull living organisms down, but in fact lifts them up. It provides a vertical kind of a gradient that my physics is getting way ahead of me, but provides lift. And this is something that we can see commonly in life and that we can experience in ourselves as we bring our posture together. That poise is a form of lift. And then the third set, I think, of complementary cooperative sort of movements is some sort of a spiral or helical pattern in the body. Now, we talked a little bit about homologies and how in the exteroceptive system, in the body in general, there is segmental homologies. And that helps us to organize the body's movements. But when we shift from between perceptual fields, from an exteroceptive to a proprioceptive field, then we also experience what I think is an inverse homology. And that helps the brain to sort of get a grip from within. I won't say any more about that. We talked a lot about the bony servo mechanisms. Here, we'll go into them a little bit more deeply. The different bony servo mechanisms on the axial line. There are no other alternatives, no other options. It's very clear what they are. We can come into each one of these sensitive areas and each one of these major bones in order to organize that area. Now, here they are laid out in the skeleton, and we can see the circles around those bones, and on the right-hand side, and highlighted in a kind of a green-blue, is each one of those prominent bony servo mechanisms. Each one is at the center of a sensitive kind of hidden concavity, the groin, the throat, the armpit, in the soles of the feet. Now, these are clearly areas in the body where we're meant to know ourselves. But what happens when we get confused? So this is a little diagram, and I'm going to finish with this diagram today about how we actually, what exteroceptive bias means. As a control bias means that we wear the body backwards. And the green areas are the axial, postural areas, the bony affordances, largely in the front, with the exception of the scapula. And these are the areas, if you think about your body now, the most sensitive areas of the body. But are these the areas where we experience the most problems? These are the areas where I think that we experience the most repression and sometimes even shame. And when we see postural collapse, we see a collapse in these areas with a tremendous amount of stress and tension and compensation required in their opposites. And those are the red areas. So when we have a head forward position, when we have collapse in this anterior structure, the back of the neck is carrying this heavy, imbalanced load. We get tension in the occiput, in the neck, and in the shoulders. When we fail to attend to the proprioceptive prior in the armpit, we make the shoulder do all the work. And of course, that's the third most common site of musculoskeletal complaints. It is not where we're meant to control the body. We're meant to find coordinative awareness in these concavities and their bony servo mechanisms. the low back. In relationship to the groin, the pubic bone in the front, the pelvis very much is shaped like a wheelbarrow. And those two big bones in the back, they're like the two big wheels or handles of a wheelbarrow. And we try our best to force that load. And we believe that we can control that load with brute strength until the front wheel of the wheelbarrow hits a pebble and the entire thing tips. So if we don't attend to the little front wheel to the low front, then we're going to have dysfunction in the low back. The feet, what I'm going to say about the feet is that that big toe is very clearly the power structure of the entire foot. And what's the first thing we do when we put it in modern shoes? Hallux valgus, we collapse, we crush that structure. So that's my talk for today, and that's an effort to unpack belief updating and exteroceptive bias in a somatic way, with reference to Sherrington, with reference to anatomy, myofascial anatomy. It's been a real pleasure. I want to ask you, if you've made it this far in the talk, that you give me some comments, give me some feedback, hopefully some positive feedback. I've worked very hard on this. Again, I'm very excited to make this unusual somatic anatomical contribution to the field of active inference. Thank you very much.